A social media influencer was stepping off a flight at Pereira's airport, phone already in hand. And then the ground itself seemed to lose its mind. In less than a minute, the deadliest earthquake to strike Colombia in more than a century turned 5 cities into disaster zones. And the story of what happened next is still being written in rubble, in hospital wards, and in the silence of buildings that used to be full of people. The numbers alone are staggering, but numbers rarely tell you what it actually felt like. A magnitude of 7.4, a depth of roughly 103 kilometers, deep enough that geologists would later say it explains why the shaking spread so far, yet shallow enough to still bring down buildings hundreds of miles from where the fault line ruptured. The epicenter sat near the small municipality of San Jose del Palmar, tucked into the department of Chaco, a region better known for rainforest than for headlines. Within seconds, the tremor raced outward through Colombia's coffee-growing heartland, an area so densely populated and economically vital that officials would later call it the country's beating agricultural heart. And that heart had just been struck directly. In Cali, Colombia's third largest city, a taxi driver named Jorge Moncayo was going about his morning when he looked up and saw something that made his blood run cold. Plumes of dust rising simultaneously across multiple neighborhoods, as if the city itself had exhaled its own destruction into the sky. He would later describe it to reporters in a tone that mixed disbelief with something closer to grief. Within Cali alone, more than 24 structures collapsed. Mayor Alejandro Eder stood before cameras hours later, visibly shaken, confirming that people remained trapped beneath the debris, and that the city had been forced to request additional emergency teams from Bogota and Medellin because Cali's own resources simply were not enough for what had just happened to it. But if Cali suffered, Pereira bled. The capital of the Risaralda department, a city famous for its coffee farms and its temperate mountain air, became the epicenter of human loss. Pereira's mayor, Mauricio Salazar, told local radio that at least 15 buildings had come down in his city alone, and that people were feared trapped beneath every single one of them. Video captured by residents, and later geolocated by international news outlets, showed the exact moment several structures in Pereira folded in on themselves, floor collapsing onto floor in what engineers call a pancake collapse, the single deadliest failure mode a building can suffer, because it leaves almost no open space, almost no pocket of air, almost no chance. One piece of footage would circulate around the world within hours. A residential building in Pereira, still standing when the recording began, starts to sway. Onlookers on the street can be heard screaming, their voices rising in pitch as the structure leans further than any building should ever lean. And then, in the space of a few seconds, it simply gives way, crumbling downward in a cloud of concrete dust that swallows the frame. Somewhere inside that cloud were families. Somewhere inside that cloud were the ordinary lives of people who had woken up that morning expecting nothing more dramatic than a normal Monday. By the time rescue crews began their first organized sweep, the scale of the disaster was only beginning to reveal itself. Colombia's newly inaugurated president, Abelardo de la Espriella, who had been sworn into office only days earlier, found himself thrust into the first major crisis of his presidency before he had even settled into it. He declared a national state of emergency and addressed the country directly. His words were measured, almost deliberately calm, the tone of a man trying to project stability while the earth beneath his own capital was still trembling with aftershocks. The national government, he said, had deployed all of its capabilities to protect lives, to assist affected communities, and to deliver aid wherever it was needed. The first priority, he told the nation, was rescuing the people trapped under the rubble. It was a simple sentence. It would take days, and it still would not be enough. What makes this earthquake so unusual and so devastating lies partly in its geology. Colombia sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped zone circling the Pacific Ocean where the majority of the world's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur. Low-intensity tremors are common there, almost a background hum of geological life. But earthquakes above magnitude 6 are rare in Colombia, and this one didn't just cross that threshold, it obliterated it. According to Colombia's Geological Service, this was the strongest seismic event recorded in the country so far this century, and by some measures, the strongest earthquake to strike Colombia in a decade. Reuters reported that seismologists were still trying to fully map the rupture even as rescue operations were underway. Because a quake this size at this depth doesn't just shake the surface, it reshapes it. There's a chilling historical echo buried in all of this. In 1999, an earthquake struck this same coffee-growing region and killed nearly 1,200 people. Older residents in Pereira in Armenia remember that disaster vividly, remember the years it took to rebuild, remember the scars that never fully disappeared from certain neighborhoods. For them, this new earthquake wasn't simply a natural disaster, it was a nightmare returning, a geological memory reawakening in the same mountains, the same valleys, the same fragile infrastructure that had never quite finished healing from the last time the ground turned against them. As the hours passed on that first day, the death toll began what would become a grim and relentless climb. President de la Espriella's initial briefing put the number at 101 dead and 87 injured. By that evening, the Colombian Association of Capital Cities, a nonprofit organization tracking data across the country's major urban centers, revised the figure upward to 132 dead and 570 injured. The organization noted, almost as a warning, that these numbers were preliminary and expected to rise because rescue teams were still receiving new reports of people trapped beneath collapsed structures that hadn't even been fully assessed yet. And rise it did. By the following morning, international outlets were reporting 169 confirmed deaths. By midday, some sources pushed the figure past 200. Within 48 hours of the initial quake, the death toll had climbed above 250, with entire regions still reporting fresh casualties as rescue crews cleared new sections of rubble. Officials in Risaralda, home to Pereira, confirmed that at least 101 people had died in that city alone. In Valle del Cauca, home to Cali, the toll reached 95. Smaller but no less devastating losses were reported across Chaco, Caldas, and Antioquia, departments where entire villages had been shaken to their foundations. The United Nations Humanitarian Office, OCHA, estimated that roughly 5,000 homes had been damaged or destroyed across the affected region, a number that hints at the sheer scale of displacement now facing Colombia. 5,000 homes is not simply a statistic. It represents thousands of families standing outside what used to be their front doors, staring at piles of brick and twisted rebar, wondering where they will sleep that night and the night after that, and possibly for months to come. In Cali, the scale of destruction extended into the city's medical infrastructure itself, striking at the very system meant to save the injured. At the University Hospital of the Valley, one of the region's most important medical facilities, officials confirmed that the building had suffered structural collapses during the quake. Hospital Administrator Toro told reporters that rescue and evacuation operations at the facility had been completed by the end of the first day, but the images that emerged were haunting nonetheless. Video verified by international news teams showed medical staff, still dressed in white, carrying infants in hospital bassinets out into the open air, evacuating newborns from a building that could no longer be trusted to keep them safe. In a country already reeling from mass casualties, the sight of a hospital failing at the exact moment it was needed most became one of the disaster's most searing images. Infrastructure damage rippled outward from there. 7 airports across western Colombia suspended operations entirely, cutting off Armenia, Cali, Manizales, Pereira, Quibdó, Buenaventura, and Cartago from incoming aid flights, until structural engineers could inspect runways and terminal buildings for safety. For a stretch of hours that felt far longer to families waiting on aid, an entire swath of western Colombia was effectively sealed off from the sky, forcing relief coordinators to reroute emergency flights toward Bogotá and then push supplies overland into a road network that was itself buckling under the strain of landslides, cracked pavement, and bridges that engineers had not yet cleared as safe to cross. Roads buckled in places, aqueducts cracked, and telecommunications networks in the hardest hit zones went dark for hours, leaving families unable to reach relatives to confirm whether they had survived. In Pereira, 16 people found themselves trapped for 6 hours inside an aerial cable car system, suspended above a city that was still shaking beneath them before rescue teams finally managed to bring them down safely, one of the disaster's rare moments where fear gave way to relief. For 6 hours, those 16 people hung above a city they could not reach and could not leave, watching dust rise from streets they knew by heart, unable to do anything but wait and trust that the cables holding them would not be the next thing to fail. When rescue teams finally reached the stalled cabins and began lowering passengers to safety, witnesses on the ground described a wave of applause rippling through the crowd below. A small, fragile moment of collective relief in a city that had precious little else to celebrate that day. It was the kind of story that spreads quickly precisely because it offers something the rest of the coverage could not. An ending, however narrow, that didn't involve loss. Not every story ended that way. In Manizales, one of the coffee region's most architecturally significant cities, footage captured the moment a side tower of the city's landmark neo-Gothic cathedral gave way, sending stone and debris scattering across nearby streets. The cathedral had stood as a symbol of the city for generations, a fixed point on the skyline that residents had grown up beneath. Watching a piece of it crumble in real time carried a weight that went beyond structural engineering, a sense that something irreplaceable had been lost alongside the human toll. In Cali, specifically, the human search and rescue effort took on staggering proportions. City officials reported that as many as 188 people remained missing in the immediate aftermath, a number that terrified families across the city as they waited by phone lines and rescue perimeters for any word of loved ones. Search teams worked through debris fields using dogs, thermal equipment, and, in many neighborhoods, nothing more sophisticated than their own hands. Residents formed human chains to move rubble, passing broken concrete block by block from strangers to strangers, all working toward the same desperate hope of hearing a voice or a tap or any sign of life beneath the wreckage. One Colombian social media influencer, Jose Gallego, happened to be recording live video the moment the earthquake struck, having just landed at Pereira's airport. His footage captured the raw chaos of the event, violent shaking, ceiling panels falling around him as he crouched beneath a table for cover, and within minutes that raw, unedited clip was circulating across the internet, becoming one of the very first pieces of documentary evidence the outside world saw of what was happening inside Pereira. In the aftermath, he described crossing the city on foot because no vehicles could move through the debris-choked streets, a journey that normally would have taken minutes but instead consumed 2 full hours. Along the way, he said, he encountered people bleeding, screaming, desperately trying to reach family members but unable to get a phone signal anywhere in the city. He recalled watching rescue teams pull both the living and the dead from the same collapsed buildings, sometimes within minutes of each other, a grim rhythm playing out on nearly every block he passed. Perhaps the most quietly devastating detail to emerge from Pereira came from a resident who had walked past a familiar building just one day before it collapsed. Only 24 hours earlier, this person had exchanged a simple greeting with neighbors living inside. Now those same neighbors were gone, buried beneath the very walls that had once sheltered them. It is a detail that captures something the death toll never can: the sheer, disorienting speed with which an entire life, an entire relationship, an entire neighborhood can be erased in the time it takes the ground to shift. The scale of this disaster quickly drew international attention and support. The United States State Department confirmed that a disaster assistance response team, known as a DART, had been dispatched to Colombia to help coordinate the government's emergency operations and assessment efforts. Washington also committed $5 million in funding aimed specifically at emergency shelter, food, protection services, and structural earthquake assessments across the affected zones. Beyond the United States, leaders across South America, Europe, and the Middle East publicly pledged support for Colombia's rescue and recovery operations, turning what had begun as a domestic tragedy into a coordinated, if urgent, international response. For President de la Espriella, the earthquake arrived as an almost impossible test of leadership, striking just days after he took the oath of office. He traveled personally to Pereira, walking through portions of the city center that had been reduced to rubble. Speaking to residents there, he described the emotional weight of witnessing the destruction firsthand, saying it broke his heart to see the local businesses, the small shops and family enterprises that formed the economic backbone of the region, reduced to broken concrete and twisted metal. In response, he announced a 3-month economic relief package, specifically for residents of Risaralda, the department containing Pereira, an attempt to give displaced families and struggling business owners at least some breathing room while the broader recovery effort got underway. Seismologists studying the event have already begun drawing comparisons to a devastating pair of earthquakes that struck neighboring Venezuela back in June, disasters that together claimed more than 6,000 lives. Experts noted one crucial difference between the two events. The Venezuelan earthquakes had struck at extremely shallow depths, less than 20 kilometers beneath the surface, a factor that tends to concentrate destructive energy directly above the rupture. Colombia's earthquake, by contrast, occurred at a depth of roughly 103 kilometers, a difference that, according to geologist Ortiz and others studying the event, likely explains both why the shaking was felt across such an enormous geographic area and why, despite its catastrophic toll, the destruction wasn't even more concentrated and severe directly above the epicenter itself. It is a strange kind of mercy buried inside a tragedy. The knowledge that a shallower rupture at this same magnitude might have been dramatically worse. The scale of the search and rescue mobilization itself became a story of its own. Local civil defense units, ordinarily staffed to handle routine emergencies, found themselves overwhelmed within hours and quickly reinforced by military engineering battalions, national police search units, and volunteer brigades that streamed in from Bogotá, Medellín, and even neighboring countries. Heavy machinery, cranes, excavators, hydraulic cutting tools was funneled toward the hardest hit blocks of Pereira and Cali. While in areas where machinery couldn't safely maneuver around unstable structures, rescue crews resorted to hand tools and sheer manual labor, clearing rubble bucket by bucket in order to avoid triggering secondary collapses onto anyone who might still be alive beneath. Search dogs, specially trained to detect human scent through concrete and debris, were deployed across dozens of collapse sites, their handlers working in punishing heat as the tropical sun beat down on rescue zones already thick with concrete dust and the acrid smell of broken gas lines. Notably, Colombia's capital, Bogotá, escaped the worst of the disaster. While residents there certainly felt the shaking, and while the interruption to daily life was significant, officials confirmed there had been no reports of collapsed buildings within the capital itself. It was a strange geography of fate, the coffee-growing towns and cities to the west absorbing catastrophic destruction, while the nation's largest city, sitting further from the epicenter, was left largely structurally intact. For families in Bogotá watching the news unfold, it created an uneasy sense of having been spared something that their fellow citizens, just a few hundred miles away, could not escape. As the recovery effort stretches into its following days, the picture emerging from Western Colombia is one of a region under siege from multiple directions at once. 5 capital cities across the country have been placed under red alert, the nation's highest level disaster classification, a designation that unlocks maximum federal resources, but also signals just how severe and unresolved the situation remains. As of the most recent tallies, officials have confirmed at least 86 buildings collapsed entirely across the disaster zone, with local authorities in Cali separately reporting 20 total structural collapses and 380 additional buildings sustaining significant damage within that city alone. Each of those numbers represents another building that engineers must now assess, another neighborhood that must be evacuated or condemned, another set of families forced to begin the agonizing process of rebuilding or relocating, or simply waiting to learn whether their home will ever be safe to enter again. What comes next for Colombia remains genuinely uncertain. Rescue teams continue combing through debris fields, even as officials acknowledge that with each passing hour, the odds of finding survivors alive beneath the rubble grow slimmer. Structural engineers are only beginning the painstaking work of inspecting the thousands of buildings left standing, but potentially compromised. Buildings that may look intact from the street, but carry hidden fractures capable of triggering a second collapse without warning. International aid continues arriving by air now that several of the region's airports have resumed limited operations. But distributing that aid across a landscape of broken roads and damaged infrastructure presents its own logistical nightmare. And there remains the question of aftershocks, the seismic echoes that so often follow an earthquake of this magnitude, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Residents across Pereira, Cali, Manizales, Armenia, and Quibdó are now living in a state of suspended anxiety, uncertain whether the ground beneath them has finished shifting, uncertain whether the next tremor will finish what this one started on already weakened structures. For a country whose newly elected president is barely a week into office, the road ahead involves not just counting the dead and treating the injured, but rebuilding an entire region's confidence in the ground itself, a process that history suggests can take not months, but years, and in some corners of Colombia's coffee country might never fully be complete at all. Beyond the visible wreckage of collapsed buildings lies a second, quieter catastrophe unfolding in the department of Chocó, one of Colombia's poorest and most remote regions, the very place where the earthquake's rupture originated. Local reporting out of Chocó described landslides triggered by the shaking that buried homes on hillsides above San José del Palmar, cutting off entire communities from the road network that connects them to the outside world. Regional officials confirmed injuries and what they described as severe structural damage in the departmental capital of Quibdó, a city already grappling with chronic underinvestment in infrastructure long before the ground began to shake. In a province where many communities were already isolated by geography, dense jungle, unpaved roads, rivers that flood without warning, this earthquake didn't just damage buildings, it severed lifelines. Aid convoys that would ordinarily take hours to reach outlying villages have instead taken days, navigating around collapsed bridges and roads buried under tons of displaced earth, while residents in the meantime rely on whatever supplies they had managed to store before the disaster struck. The economic aftershocks of this earthquake are only beginning to be understood, but for a country whose identity is deeply tied to its coffee industry, the timing could hardly have been worse. The departments hit hardest, Risaralda, Caldas, and parts of Valle del Cauca, sit at the very heart of what growers and exporters call the coffee axis, a mountainous belt of farms responsible for a significant share of Colombia's agricultural export economy, and by extension, its national identity on the world stage. Processing facilities, warehouses, and rural cooperative offices scattered throughout the region reported damage alongside the residential buildings that dominated the headlines, raising early concerns among agricultural economists about disruptions to the upcoming harvest season. For thousands of small farming families who depend on that harvest for their entire annual income, a damaged processing plant or a blocked mountain road isn't simply an inconvenience. It is the difference between a stable year and a year of real hardship, layered directly on top of the physical trauma the earthquake has already inflicted on their communities. Inside Cali and Pereira, the psychological toll of the disaster is becoming as visible as the physical one. Mental health workers deployed to emergency shelters have described residents who flinch at every truck that rumbles past, every door that slams, every faint tremor that may or may not be an aftershock. Children in particular have shown signs of acute distress, refusing to enter any building, even ones cleared as structurally sound by inspection teams, insisting instead on sleeping outdoors or in vehicles alongside their parents. Colombian psychologists interviewed by local media have warned that this kind of collective trauma, especially layered onto a region still carrying generational memory of the 1999 earthquake, tends to outlast the physical rebuilding by years, shaping how an entire generation of children in the Coffee region will relate to the buildings they live and study in for decades to come. Inside the disaster zones, rescue crews have described a grueling and often heartbreaking rhythm to their work. Teams equipped with listening devices, sensitive enough to detect a faint tapping sound beneath meters of concrete, have spent entire nights working a single collapsed structure, coordinating silence across an entire city block so that the equipment can pick up the faintest signs of life. In several documented cases across Pereira and Cali that patients paid off, survivors pulled from voids no larger than a coffin, having endured hours, in some cases more than a day, trapped in total darkness before rescue workers finally broke through to reach them. City officials in Cali confirmed that in the earliest hours of the response, 2 survivors, an elderly woman and a young girl, were successfully rescued alive from the rubble, a moment that briefly lifted the mood of exhausted crews working through the debris field around them. But for every rescue that ended in relief, officials acknowledged others that ended only in recovery, bodies rather than survivors, a distinction rescue workers learned to brace themselves for with every new section of debris they cleared. The scale of displacement created by this earthquake is difficult to overstate. With an estimated 5,000 homes damaged or destroyed and hundreds of additional buildings condemned pending structural review, local governments across the Coffee region have scrambled to establish emergency shelters in schools, sports stadiums, and community centers. Any structure large enough to house displaced families and sturdy enough to be trusted after the very ground it stands on has already betrayed so many others. Aid organizations distributing food, water, and temporary bedding have described shelters filling well beyond capacity within the first 48 hours, with additional families arriving daily as inspectors continue condemning buildings once thought to have survived the initial shaking undamaged. For many of these families, the earthquake didn't end when the shaking stopped. It is, in a very real sense, still happening, playing out now in the form of displacement, uncertainty, and the slow, anxious wait to learn whether the home they fled will ever be theirs to return to. International engineers and disaster response specialists arriving alongside aid shipments have begun raising broader questions about building codes and construction standards across Colombia's rapidly urbanized coffee cities, questions that will likely shape public debate long after the immediate rescue operations conclude. Pereira and Cali, like many mid-sized Latin American cities, have expanded rapidly over recent decades, with multi-story residential construction often outpacing the regulatory infrastructure meant to ensure earthquake resilience. While it remains too early for a definitive engineering assessment of why certain buildings pancaked while neighboring structures of similar age and height remained standing, early observations from structural engineers on the ground suggest that construction quality, and specifically the reinforcement techniques used in mid-rise residential buildings built during earlier decades, will become a central and uncomfortable subject of national conversation in the weeks ahead, one that touches on questions of enforcement, oversight, and accountability stretching back long before this earthquake ever struck. For now, though, the priority on the ground remains unchanged from the moment President de la Espriella first addressed the nation. Find the living, recover the dead, feed and shelter the displaced. Behind every one of those tasks lies a number that keeps climbing, a toll that officials themselves admit remains incomplete, with search teams still working through debris fields in Pereira, Cali, Quibdó, Manizales, and Armenia days after the initial rupture. Colombia's public ministry has cautioned that the final death toll may not be known for some time yet, not until every collapsed structure has been fully cleared, not until every missing name has either been found alive or laid finally to rest. What is already certain is that this earthquake will be remembered as a defining moment in Colombia's modern history, one that arrived without warning, tested a brand new government within days of its formation, and exposed just how much vulnerability still lies beneath the surface of some of the country's most vital cities. The Coffee region will rebuild, as it rebuilt after 1999, brick by brick and street by street, but the shape of that recovery, how long it takes, how many families are able to return home, how many businesses reopen their doors, remains impossible to predict from where things stand right now. Until then, this remains an unfinished story, one still being written in the wreckage of a region that, for generations, believed the worst earthquake in its living memory had already happened back in 1999, and never imagined the ground had one more, far larger blow still waiting to fall.